There are civilizations that leave ruins, and then there are civilizations that leave ghosts. The Aztecs left both. At the height of their power, the Aztec Empire was home to somewhere between 5 and 6 million people. Their capital, Tenochtitlan, sat in the middle of a lake in the high valleys of central Mexico, built on a floating island of their own construction, connected to the mainland by vast causeways wide enough for 10 men to walk abreast. When Spanish soldiers first laid eyes on it in 1509, they wept, not from grief, but from disbelief. Hernán Cortés himself wrote to the King of Spain that there were no words in the language, none at all, adequate to describe what he was seeing. A city larger than any in Europe, a city that should not have been possible. And yet, it was there. To understand the Aztecs, you must first let go of what you think you know about them. The word Aztec itself is something of a historical shorthand, a collected name attached to them by later scholars. They called themselves the Mexica. They called their home Tenochtitlan. They called their world the fifth sun, and they believed with absolute sincerity that it was their sacred responsibility to keep that sun rising each morning. This was not a metaphor. This was the organizing principle of an entire civilization. The Mexica did not arrive in the Valley of Mexico with wealth or power. They arrived as wanderers. Their own origin stories, preserved and sung across generations, describe a long migration from a mythical homeland to the north called Aztlan, a journey guided by the commands of their patron god, Huitzilopochtli, the hummingbird of the south, a deity of war and of the sun. For over 2 centuries they moved, displaced and looked down upon by the established city-states of the valley, forced into swamplands and marginal territories that no one else wanted. They were, by any reasonable account, the last people anyone expected to build an empire. But empires are rarely built by the expected. By 1428, through a combination of ruthless political maneuvering, strategic alliance, and military brilliance, the Mexica had formed what historians call the Triple Alliance, a coalition with 2 neighboring city-states, Texcoco and Tlacopan, that would form the structural skeleton of everything that followed. Within a generation, this alliance had conquered the valley. Within 2 generations, it had stretched from the Gulf Coast to the Pacific, encompassing hundreds of distinct ethnic groups, city-states, and peoples, all feeding tribute upward to the great lake city in the mountains. At the center of all of this was Tenochtitlan. Describing it as merely a city feels almost dishonest. It was an achievement of engineering that rivals anything the ancient world produced. The Mexica built chinampas, what we sometimes call floating gardens, great mats of woven reeds and earth anchored to the lake floor, rich enough in nutrients to yield multiple harvests each year. They built aqueducts to bring fresh water into a city surrounded by salt. They dredged canals through which canoes moved like blood through veins. They constructed the great temple, the Templo Mayor, at the very heart of the city, a massive stepped pyramid rising toward the sky, oriented to align with the movements of celestial bodies, rebuilt and enlarged by each successive ruler in a cycle of cosmic renewal. The people who lived in and around this world were not a faceless mass. They were farmers and merchants, poets and astronomers, priests and warriors, craftsmen who worked obsidian with a precision that modern tools struggle to replicate. They had schools. The Calmecac trained the children of the elite in theology, astronomy, oratory, and the arts of governance. The Telpochcalli educated commoners in civic duty and the fundamentals of warfare. Education was not a privilege of the nobility. Education was, in the Mexica view, something closer to a civic obligation. Their calendar system ran in parallel cycles, one a 365-day solar calendar, another a 260-day ritual calendar, and where these 2 interlocking wheels aligned every 52 years, the Mexica held a ceremony of extraordinary gravity. The new fire ceremony. All flames were extinguished across the empire. All people waited in darkness on the hillsides, while priests climbed to a sacred mountain and watched the night sky. If the stars moved as they should, a new fire was kindled on the chest of a sacrificial victim, and runners carried that flame to every corner of the empire. Life, renewed. The sun, given another 52 years. This was the Aztec world. Vast and intricate, beautiful and brutal, utterly assured of its own cosmological necessity, a civilization that held itself responsible for the continuation of time itself. And in 1519, it had perhaps 2 years left. What follows is the story of how it lived, what it believed, how it waged war, how it saw the divine, and finally, how it fell. It is a story that does not belong to one side or one verdict. It belongs to the full, complicated, devastating sweep of human history. We begin, as the Mexica always began, with the gods. Before there was an empire, before there were warriors or merchants or floating gardens or causeways of stone stretching across still water, there was a question. It was the same question that every human civilization has carried since the first person looked up at the night sky and felt the vast, indifferent weight of the universe pressing down upon them. Why are we here, and what does it cost to remain? For the Mexica, the answer to that question was not comforting, but it was complete. The universe did not begin with order. It began with conflict. In the Mexica account of creation, the cosmos had already died 4 times before human beings ever drew breath. 4 previous suns, 4 previous worlds. Each one fashioned by the gods and each one destroyed, torn apart by the same divine rivalries and cosmic imbalances that had created them. The first sun was a world of jaguars. The second, a world of wind. The third fell in a rain of fire. The fourth drowned beneath a flood so total it swallowed everything. And from each of these ruined worlds, the gods had tried again, reworking the raw material of existence, assembling something new from what the previous catastrophe had left behind. The fifth sun, the current world, the world in which the Mexica lived and breathed and built their empire, was different, not because it was more stable, not because the gods had finally resolved their ancient quarrels, but because this time the creation had required sacrifice on a scale that none of the previous attempts had demanded. According to the most sacred Mexica texts, the gods gathered in darkness at a place called Teotihuacan, the ancient ruined city they regarded as holy ground, and 2 of their number willingly threw themselves into a great fire. From their immolation, the sun and the moon were born. But the newborn sun refused to move. It simply hung in the sky, inert and enormous, and without movement there would be no days, no seasons, no cycle of life. The only thing that could make it rise, the only currency the universe would accept, was blood. The gods themselves opened their veins and bled into the void, and the sun began to move. This is the theological foundation beneath everything the Mexica built. The gods had bled to create the world. The world, therefore, owed the gods a debt that could never be fully repaid, only serviced, endlessly, through offering. And the most potent offering, the most direct echo of what the gods had given, was the blood and beating heart of a human being. To understand Mexican religion is to understand that this was not cruelty for cruelty's sake. It was not theater designed to terrify subject peoples, though it certainly achieved that effect. It was, in the Mexica conception of reality, something closer to maintenance. The sun moved because it was fed. If it was not fed, it would stop. And if it stopped, everything stopped. Every person alive, every child, every field of maize, every city and mountain and river would cease to exist. Human sacrifice, in this framework, was not an act of violence. It was an act of cosmic responsibility. It was the Mexica paying the rent on existence itself. The pantheon through which this theology expressed itself was vast, layered, and in constant dialogue with itself. There were hundreds of deities, each governing specific domains of natural and human experience, and they were not distant abstractions. They were present. They moved through the world in specific seasons, on specific days of the ritual calendar, making certain times propitious and others dangerous, shaping the fate of individuals from the moment of their birth. Huitzilopochtli, the hummingbird of the south, was the patron of the Mexican nation and the god of the sun and warfare. His mythology was vivid and violent. He had been born, fully armed, from his mother Coatlicue, the goddess of earth and death, at the very moment his 400 siblings attempted to murder her. He emerged already fighting, driving them off with a weapon of fire called the Xiuhcoatl, the turquoise serpent, and hurling his sister Coyolxauhqui, the moon goddess, down a mountain and dismembering her. This myth was enacted in stone at the base of the Templo Mayor, where a great carved disc depicted Coyolxauhqui shattered and broken, her body scattered in pieces. Every prisoner sacrificed at the summit of the temple and cast down its steps was, in some theological sense, a reenactment of that primal victory. The sun triumphing over the moon, day defeating night. The cycle renewed. Tlaloc was ancient beyond the Mexica themselves. The rain god, the god of water and agriculture and mountain storms, predated the Mexica migration by centuries. His wide goggle eyes and fanged mouth appeared on monuments across central Mexico long before Tenochtitlan was even imagined. He shared the summit of the Templo Mayor with Huitzilopochtli, the two great temples sitting side by side on the same pyramid, rain and war, agriculture and conquest, the two pillars on which the empire rested. Tlaloc's sacrifices were different in character. He required children, specifically children whose tears were regarded as a form of sympathetic rain magic, and the festivals held in his honor during the dry season were among the most solemn in the entire calendar. Then there was Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent. He was, in certain respects, the most philosophically complex figure in the entire Mexica cosmos, a god associated with wind, with learning, with the priesthood, with the arts of civilization itself. His mythology described him as a god who had opposed human sacrifice, who had preached that offerings of butterflies and flowers were sufficient tribute to the divine. He was said to have left on a raft of serpents, sailing east across the sea, promising to return in the year 1 read on the Mexica calendar. And when Hernan Cortés arrived from the east in the year 1 read, the implications of that coincidence were not lost on the Mexica court. The extent to which this shaped the initial Mexica response to the Spanish remains one of the great historical debates of the period, complicated and contested. But the mythology was real, and its shadow fell across those first encounters in ways that neither side fully understood. Tezcatlipoca, the smoking mirror, was Huitzilopochtli's great rival, dark, omniscient, associated with the night sky and with sorcery, and with the jaguar. He was a god who tested humanity, who sent misfortune to reveal character, who saw everything through his obsidian mirror and judged without sentiment. The relationship between Tezcatlipoca and Quetzalcoatl was one of the driving narratives of Mexica cosmology, two opposing principles, locked in eternal tension, darkness and light, chaos and order, neither one able to finally overwhelm the other. This cosmology was not simply believed, it was administered. The priestly class of Mexica society was extensive, hierarchical, and professionally trained. Priests maintained the temples, calculated the movements of celestial bodies, interpreted the ritual calendar, conducted the ceremonies, and educated the children of the elite. They fasted and bled themselves ritually, drawing cactus spines through their tongues and earlobes as acts of devotion. They slept very little. They dressed in black and wore their hair long and matted with the dried blood of offerings. They were, by any external measure, a striking and somewhat terrifying presence. But within the Mexica world, they were something more like scientists, specialists in the management of forces that governed all life, men whose precision and attention were all that stood between the current world and the oblivion that had claimed the four worlds before it. The ritual calendar, the tonal powali, was their primary instrument, running in a cycle of 260 days. It was divided into 20 groups of 13 days each, and every single day within it carried a specific name, number, and divine patron that determined its character. Children born on certain days were considered fortunate, gifted, destined for greatness. Children born on others were thought to carry misfortune from the moment of their first breath, though even this could be mitigated. A child born on an inauspicious day might have their naming ceremony delayed until the calendar turned to something more favorable. The Mexica believed, with the same confidence that a physician believes in the body's systems, that time was a living structure, that its qualities varied day to day, and that understanding those qualities was simply good sense. Death, in this worldview, was not an ending. It was a transition, and the nature of that transition depended not on the moral quality of a person's life, but on the manner of their death. Warriors who died in battle, or captives who died in sacrifice, went to accompany the sun on its daily journey across the sky. Women who died in childbirth, who in Mexico thinking were considered warriors themselves, joined the sun on its descent each evening. Drowning victims and those struck by lightning went to Tlaloc's paradise, a watered and abundant realm. Most people, those who died of illness or old age, made a long journey through the 9 layers of the underworld, Mictlan, guided by a small dog that was often sacrificed and buried with them, until they finally reached the deepest level and dissolved into the dark matter from which all things had first emerged. The cosmos, then, was not a backdrop. It was an active participant in every moment of Mexica life. The gods were not distant. They were woven into the fabric of daily experience, present in the rain and the corn and the sun rising each morning, and the particular quality of light on any given day. The Mexica did not feel abandoned by the divine. They felt surrounded by it, watched by it, sustained by it, and obligated to it in ways that structured every hour of their existence. And this is what makes the eventual collision with Spanish Christianity so extraordinarily complex. The conquistadors arrived carrying a theology that was, in its own way, equally absolute. They too had a God who had bled to redeem the world. They too had rituals through which divine flesh was consumed. They too built towering structures to their faith and organized their societies around the demands of the sacred. The precise nature of the theological incompatibility between these two worlds, one that insisted on blood freely given upward to sustain the universe, the other on blood once given from above to redeem a fallen humanity, is one of the deep ironies of the conquest. Two civilizations equally convinced of their divine mandate, equally certain that the cosmos depended on their particular relationship with the sacred. Only one of them had cannons, but before the world ended, there was still an empire to run, and running it, holding together a coalition of hundreds of city-states and ethnic groups across thousands of square miles of mountains, coasts, and valleys, required something beyond theology and military power. It required, as it has always required in every civilization that has ever attempted it, an extraordinary machinery of governance, trade, tribute, and social order. That machinery is where we go next. An empire is not a conquest. Conquest is merely the violent beginning. What comes after? The administration of millions of people across landscapes that a message on foot might take weeks to cross. The collection of tribute from peoples who resent you. The maintenance of loyalty among allies who are always calculating their own advantage. That is where empires are truly built or quietly lost. The Mexica understood this with a clarity that often goes unappreciated. Their empire was not, in the modern sense, a unified state. There was no single legal code applied from the Gulf Coast to the Pacific. There was no standing bureaucracy of civil servants rotating through provincial postings. What the Mexica built was something more subtle and, in its own way, more elegant. It was a system of relationships, enforced by the credible threat of overwhelming military force, sustained by economic interdependence, and lubricated by the constant movement of goods, people, and information between the capital and the hundreds of subject communities that fed it. The mechanism at the heart of this system was tribute. Every city-state, every ethnic group, every community that fell within the empire's reach was assessed. Tribute collectors, called Calpixca, traveled to subject territories and maintained detailed records of what each community owed and when it was due. These records were kept in painted books, the tribute rolls, some of which survived the conquest and remain among the most extraordinary administrative documents of the ancient world. What they reveal is a system of almost staggering organizational complexity. From the lowland tropical regions came rubber balls, used in the great ceremonial ball game, along with cacao, vanilla, brilliant feathers from birds that did not exist in the high valleys, and jaguar pelts. From the coastal regions came dried fish and salt and cotton, already spun into cloth. From the agricultural heartlands came maize, beans, amaranth, and chia by the thousands of bushels. From conquered gold-working regions came finished jewelry and raw metal. From communities known for their craft traditions came pottery, decorated textiles, and worked obsidian tools. The volume of this tribute was extraordinary. Tenochtitlan received, on a regular cycle, hundreds of thousands of cotton cloaks alone, tens of thousands of warrior costumes made from feathers and precious stones, enough food to feed a city of 200,000 people and still have surplus for redistribution, for the feeding of armies, for the provisioning of the vast temple establishment and its constant ceremonies. But tribute was not simply extraction, it was also a signal. The act of paying tribute acknowledged the cosmic and political order the Mexica represented. Communities that paid were, in the Mexica conception, participating correctly in the structure of the world. They were not merely defeated peoples being bled dry. They were, at least in the official theology of the empire, part of the great system through which the sun was kept moving and the world was kept alive. This framing did not make the tribute less burdensome, but it gave it a meaning that pure extraction could not have provided. And meaning, even unwelcome meaning, is something human communities have always been able to absorb more readily than meaningless compulsion. Not all subject peoples were treated identically. The Mexica operated along a spectrum of control. Some communities were deeply integrated into the imperial structure, their local rulers confirmed in power by Tenochtitlan, their children sometimes sent to the capital for education, their elites intermarried with Mexica nobility. Others were held at a greater distance, required to pay tribute and provide military support, but otherwise left to govern themselves by their own customs and laws. Still others occupied a kind of armed neutrality, unconquered but encircled, existing within the shadow of the empire without formally submitting to it. The Tlaxcalans, that would prove so decisive in the events of 1519 and 1520, fell into a version of this last category. They had resisted Mexican expansion for generations, maintaining their independence through a combination of fierce military resistance and rugged geography, and the Mexica, rather than destroying them outright, had allowed them to persist, partly as a source of captives for sacrifice taken in the ritualized conflicts called flower wars, and partly, perhaps, as a demonstration of imperial magnanimity. It was a calculation that would ultimately cost the empire everything. Sitting alongside this tribute system, and in many ways as important to the empire's functioning, was the merchant class. The Mexican merchants, called Pochteca, occupied a position in their society that was as paradoxical as it was powerful. They were commoners by birth, not nobles. And in a society as rigidly stratified as Mexican civilization, that distinction carried enormous weight. They could not wear certain garments, they could not display their wealth ostentatiously in public without risking official displeasure. By the conventions of their own culture, they were required to project a kind of deliberate modesty, entering the city at night when they returned from long trading expeditions so as not to attract attention, carrying their goods quietly rather than in triumphal procession. And yet the Pochteca were, by any practical measure, one of the most powerful groups in the empire. They traveled to distant regions that Mexican armies had never reached, trading in luxury goods, rare materials, and information. They had their own courts, their own legal systems, their own patron deity in Yaxcatecutli, the Lord who guides, whose staff symbolized the walking stick of the traveling merchant. They trained their children in their own schools, passing down trade routes and commercial knowledge across generations with the same careful attention that noble families pass down political connections. They were the empire's eyes and ears in foreign territories, gathering intelligence about distant peoples, their military strength, their resources, their political vulnerabilities. When the Mexica eventually moved to conquer a new region, the merchants had often been there for years already, mapping the terrain in commercial terms. The market that served Tenochtitlan was held in the adjacent city of Tlatelolco, and it was, by the accounts of the Spanish soldiers who saw it, one of the most astonishing things they had encountered anywhere in their lives. Bernal Diaz del Castillo, a soldier who walked through it with Cortés, and who later wrote one of the most vivid first-hand accounts of the conquest, described it with a wonder that decades had not dimmed by the time he set down his memoirs. Thousands of people moved through it on any given day. There were sections for goldsmiths and sections for feather workers, sections for slaves, who were sold in wooden collars but had legal rights and could purchase their freedom. Sections for herbalists and healers, selling medicinal plants alongside food vendors, selling cooked meals to be eaten standing up. There were barbers and potters and sellers of obsidian blades so sharp they were still used for surgery in some contexts. There were judges, officials who circulated through the market to resolve disputes on the spot. There was a standardized system of exchange using cacao beans as currency for small transactions, cotton cloaks of standardized size for larger ones, and gold dust measured in quills for the most valuable dealings. This was not a primitive bazaar. This was a sophisticated commercial system with regulation, standardization, and legal oversight, embedded in a city whose urban planning, public sanitation, and food distribution systems compared favorably to anything contemporary Europe could offer. Within the city itself, society was organized around the Calpulli, a unit that combined elements of what we might today call a neighborhood, a clan, and a professional guild. Each Calpulli controlled its own land, had its own temple, its own school, its own patron deity, and its own internal governance. Membership was hereditary. The land belonged to the Calpulli collectively and was distributed to families for use but could not be sold. In this way, the Mexica preserved a form of communal land tenure that prevented the extreme concentration of agricultural wealth, even as the nobility accumulated enormous personal riches through conquest and tribute. The nobility itself, the Pipiltin, was a hereditary class, whose privileges were extensive, but whose obligations were equally demanding. Noble children attended the Calmacac, where the curriculum was severe. They fasted frequently. They endured cold and hardship as a deliberate element of their training. They were expected to master oratory, a skill the Mexica valued with something close to reverence. There is a body of Mexica literature called the Huitlatoli, the speeches of the elders, formal addresses given at the significant moments of life, at births and marriages and deaths and the installation of rulers, that are among the most remarkable documents to survive from the ancient Americas. They speak in a formal, doubled style, where ideas are expressed twice in parallel phrases that reinforce and deepen each other, and their subject matter encompasses everything from parenting to governance to the nature of the divine to the proper comportment of a woman entering marriage. They are, in the deepest sense, a portrait of what the Mexica thought the good life looked like and what virtues a human being ought to carry through the world. At the apex of this entire structure sat the Tlatoani, the speaker, the ruler of Tenochtitlan, who by the height of the empire's power had accumulated a degree of authority that made the title feel almost deliberately understated. He was surrounded by elaborate protocols of deference. Those who approached him were required to remove their sandals and bow. He was carried in a litter. His food was served behind a screen so that no one could watch him eat. He consulted a council of senior nobles and priests, but his authority in matters of war and religion was effectively absolute. He was not a god, not in the Mexica theological sense, but he was the human axis around which the empire turned, the point of contact between the political and the divine, the person most responsible for ensuring that the tribute flowed, the ceremonies were conducted, the armies marched, and the sun continued to rise. The last man to hold this role fully, before the world began to come apart, was Moctezuma Xocoyotzin, known to history by a simplified version of his name, and it was on his shoulders that the entire weight of what was coming would ultimately fall. He was, by all accounts, a man of formidable intelligence, deep religious conviction, and a political temperament that tended toward deliberation rather than instinct. He had been, before his election as Tlatoani, a successful military commander and a high priest. He was not, in other words, a man who had risen to his position without having understood the empire from multiple angles. He knew its theology and its armies. He knew its merchant networks and its tribute systems. He knew its political vulnerabilities, the subject peoples who resented their tribute obligations, the unconquered rivals who watched for weakness. What he did not know, what he could not have known, was that the largest vulnerability in the entire system was not internal at all. It was approaching by sea from the east, and the machinery of the empire, for all its sophistication, for all the genius of its tribute rolls and its market judges and its merchant spies, had no mechanism that could process what was coming. In the Mexica world, there was no more important moment in a young man's life than his first battle. Not his birth, not his marriage, not the naming ceremony conducted over his infant body by a priest reading the tonal Porwali for signs of what kind of person the calendar said he would become. Those were significant. But the first battle was something else entirely. It was the moment at which a boy crossed a threshold that could not be uncrossed. The moment at which he either became something or did not. And what he was trying to become, more than anything, was a captor. This is the first thing to understand about Mexica warfare, the thing that separates it most fundamentally from the kind of warfare that European soldiers of the 16th century practiced and understood. The primary objective of a Mexica warrior in battle was not to kill his opponent. It was to take him alive. A dead enemy was a military outcome. A living captive brought back to Tenochtitlan in ropes, presented at the temple, and eventually offered to the gods in sacrifice, was a theological achievement. It was a contribution to the maintenance of the cosmos. It was, within the value system of Mexica society, the single most honorable thing a man could do with his life. The warrior who took captives rose. The warrior who did not, did not. Young men entered military training early, and every male in Mexica society, regardless of social class, spent time in the Telpocali, the youth house, where the basics of warfare were taught alongside civic obligation. They learned the weapons, the macuahuitl, the fearsome obsidian-edged wooden club that could take a limb off cleanly, and that Spanish soldiers described with a mixture of professional respect and visceral alarm. They learned the atlatl, the spear thrower, and the bow, and the techniques of close combat that the macuahuitl demanded. They learned to fight in formation and to move across terrain quickly. But above all, they were taught the purpose of all this training, which was not slaughter but capture. Not the ending of an enemy's life on the battlefield, but the bringing of him home to serve a purpose larger than any individual death could serve. A young warrior's first campaign was spent attached to experienced fighters, watching and carrying equipment, present at the violence, but not yet a participant in it. He was, in the terminology the Mexica used, being shown the flower of war, observing the shape of what combat actually looked like, stripped of its ceremonial distance. When he finally entered battle himself, everything depended on what happened next. If he took a captive with the help of other warriors, he received partial credit, but no full elevation in status. If he took a captive alone, the recognition was immediate and substantial. He could change what he wore, how he cut his hair, what he ate, and where he sat at public ceremonies. 3 captives taken alone, and he entered a category of warrior that ordinary Mexica society regarded with something close to reverence. The warriors who achieved the highest distinction joined the elite military orders that sat at the apex of the Mexica martial hierarchy. The 2 most famous of these were the Eagle Warriors and the Jaguar Warriors, and they are among the most recognizable images to survive from the civilization, depicted in sculpture and painted manuscripts and ceramic figures with a vividness that centuries have not diminished. The Eagle Warriors wore suits of feathers and helmets shaped like open eagle beaks, their faces visible through the gaping mouth of the bird. The Jaguar Warriors wore the actual pelts of jaguars, the spotted skin pulled over helmet and shoulders so that the warrior's face looked out from the open jaws of the great cat. These were not merely costumes. They were statements of cosmological identity. The eagle was the creature of the daytime sky, the sun's companion and symbol. The jaguar was the creature of the night, Tezcatlipoca's animal, associated with the power that moved in darkness. A warrior dressed as an eagle was aligning himself with the solar force that Huitzilopochtli embodied. A warrior dressed as a jaguar was claiming the power of the night itself. Together, they were the twin embodiments of Mexica martial theology, day and night, sun and shadow, fighting in the service of a cosmos that needed both. There was also a 3rd elite order, less discussed, but in certain respects even more striking. The Coatlicue, sometimes translated as the Shorn Ones, were warriors who had taken so many captives, demonstrated such sustained ferocity in battle, that they had moved beyond the regular hierarchy of status into something closer to a warrior priesthood. They shaved their heads except for a single lock above the left ear. They painted half their face blue and half their face red or yellow. They took public oaths before witnesses that they would never retreat in battle, that they would hold their ground regardless of the odds, that they would die where they stood before they surrendered ground. These oaths were not rhetorical. They were binding in the most serious theological sense the Mexica possessed. A Coatlic who retreated faced not only social death, but something approaching cosmic shame. They were frequently placed at the most dangerous points in any battle formation, human anchors around whom the rest of the army could maneuver and reform. The battles these warriors fought ranged from the straightforwardly expansionist, large-scale campaigns aimed at bringing new territories under Mexica tribute obligations to the ritualized and formally bounded conflicts known to history as the Flower Wars. The Flower Wars, Xochiahuayotl in Nahuatl, deserve particular attention because they have been the subject of considerable historical debate and because they illuminate something genuinely distinctive about the Mexica approach to organized violence. The Flower Wars were not ordinary campaigns of conquest. They were prearranged conflicts, agreed upon by both sides in advance, conducted at specific times and in specific places, between the Mexica and their allies on one side, and various neighboring states, most commonly the Tlaxcalans, the Huexotzincans, and the Cholulans on the other. Both sides knew when the battle would occur. Both sides sent warriors. Both sides fought with the explicit understanding that the primary purpose was not territorial acquisition or the destruction of the enemy, but the taking of captives on both sides for sacrifice. The conflict was scheduled in the way that a religious ceremony is scheduled, because that is, in the deepest sense, what it was. Historians have debated whether the Flower Wars were purely ritual affairs, or whether they also served a strategic function, maintaining military readiness, testing new warriors, and keeping neighboring states in a perpetual state of controlled weakness by bleeding them of their best fighters at regular intervals. The answer is probably that they were both simultaneously, which is consistent with the way the Mexica generally thought about the relationship between the sacred and the practical. These were not, for the Mexica, separate categories requiring separate kinds of explanation. A battle that served the gods and simultaneously served the state was not a contradiction. It was an elegant solution to two problems at once. What the Flower Wars also reveal is something important about the geography of Mexican imperial power. The states that participated in these ritualized conflicts, particularly the Tlaxcalans, were not conquered. They had resisted Mexican expansion successfully enough that an outright military solution had become prohibitively costly. The Flower Wars were, among other things, a way of managing that unresolved tension, of maintaining a relationship with unconquered neighbors that served the empire's religious needs without requiring the empire to admit, publicly and definitively, that there were limits to its military reach. That the Tlaxcalans would ultimately become the most important military allies of Hernán Cortés is one of the great ironies of the conquest, and it cannot be understood without understanding the accumulated generations of grievance and conflict that the Flower Wars both expressed and perpetuated. The weapons and tactics of the Mexican army were formidable on their own terms, and within the context of the warfare they had been designed for. The macuajo rifle was a devastating weapon in close combat, its obsidian edges capable of inflicting terrible wounds. The Tlahuis matlatoli, a kind of short bow, could be used effectively from behind the large wooden and leather shields that formed the front ranks of a Mexican formation. Slings cast stones with enough force to kill or incapacitate. The atlatl could drive a dart through light armor at considerable range. Mexican armies moved quickly, sustained by a logistical system that required warriors to carry their own provisions for initial campaigns, supplemented by tribute stores in subject territories along established routes. Larger campaigns involved genuine supply chain management, with porters organized to move provisions ahead of the main force. Before major battles, there was ritual. Priests accompanied armies on campaign. Sacrifices were conducted before engagements to weed the omens and secure divine favor. Warriors painted themselves according to their rank and order, the colors and patterns as meaningful to Mexican observers as any modern military insignia. Drums, conch shell horns, and whistles coordinated movement across the battlefield noise. The psychological dimension of Mexican warfare was as carefully considered as the tactical, and an army advancing in formation, painted and feathered, sounding their drums and horns, was designed to be an experience that reached into something deeper than tactical calculation in the minds of those facing them. What this military system was not designed for was cavalry, or steel swords, or firearms, or a determined enemy willing to kill rather than capture, willing to keep pressing into a formation rather than stepping back to create the space needed for a clean capture hold. These are the variables that the Flower Wars and the campaigns of imperial expansion had never required the Mexican military to account for. And when those variables arrived in 1519, the army that had expanded an empire across half of Mesoamerica found itself facing a form of warfare for which its entire professional culture had left it unprepared in specific and consequential ways. But this is a story for later, and it would be a mistake to let the ending overshadow the achievement. At its height, the Mexican military was one of the most effective fighting forces in the ancient world on its own terms. It had expanded the empire from a small city-state in a lake to a network of tribute-paying territories stretching across hundreds of thousands of square miles. It had subdued peoples who had fought back fiercely. It had moved armies across mountain ranges and tropical lowlands with a logistical sophistication that matched any contemporary military tradition. It had produced, in its elite warrior orders, fighters of genuine and extraordinary skill and courage, who operated within a value system that demanded from them not merely effectiveness but a kind of ongoing theological heroism, the willingness to risk not just life but cosmic standing, to walk into battle knowing that their deaths, if they came, would be meaningful in ways that extended beyond any individual life. There is a poem that survives from the Mexica tradition, preserved in the great collections of Nahuatl language texts, that the Franciscan friar Bernardino de Sahagún compiled in the decades after the conquest by interviewing Mexica survivors. It speaks about the transience of life and the particular beauty of the warrior's death. It asks what it means for a flower to bloom, what it means for a man to live with valor, and it concludes not with grief but with something more complicated, a kind of fierce acceptance of the fact that the most beautiful things are the most fragile, that the flower and the warrior and the sun itself are precious precisely because they can be extinguished. The Mexica warrior went to battle carrying all of this: the theology, the status system, the weight of his order's history and its oaths, the knowledge that the gods themselves had bled to give him this world and that he owed them something real in return. He went to battle, in other words, not merely as a soldier, but as a participant in a drama whose stakes were nothing less than the continuation of existence. That is not a small thing to carry into a field of violence. And for the young man who came home with his first captive stumbling in ropes ahead of him, who walked back into Tenochtitlan with the right to change his clothes and cut his hair differently, and sit in a place of honor at the next ceremony, the world must have felt, in that moment, exactly as large and as meaningful as he had always been told it was. It is easy, when studying a civilization as dramatic as the Mexica, to spend all of one's time in the temples and the throne rooms, among the gods and the generals, and to lose sight entirely of the person who woke up each morning before dawn and went about the ordinary business of being alive. But civilizations are not built by their most extraordinary figures. They are built, sustained, and given their texture by the vast majority of people who never appear in any tribute roll or royal chronicle, who never took a captive in battle or performed a ceremony at the summit of a pyramid, but who fed their children, tended their gardens, bargained in the marketplace, and went to bed each night beneath the same sky that the priests were watching for omens. Those people deserve their chapter. The day began early in Tenochtitlan. Before the sun had fully cleared the mountains to the east, the sounds of the city were already building. Women rose first, and the grinding of dried maize on stone metates was as reliable a signal of morning in a Mexica household as any rooster. Maize was not merely a staple food in the Mexica diet. It was, in their cosmology, the substance from which human beings had been made. The gods had tried other materials in earlier creations, wood and mud among them, and found them wanting. It was only when Quetzalcoatl brought maize from the sacred mountain where it was hidden that the gods had the raw material adequate for human flesh. Eating maize was therefore, at some level of cultural awareness, eating the stuff of your own creation. It was a daily reminder, quiet and unremarked, of the connection between the human body and the divine craft that had fashioned it. Tortillas, tamales, and a thick porridge called atole formed the foundation of most meals. These were supplemented by beans, squash, chili peppers, tomatoes, and an enormous variety of other vegetables that the Chinampas produced in quantities that astonished outside observers. The lake itself provided protein in abundance, fish and waterfowl, and the eggs of birds that nested in the reeds along the shore, along with a remarkable food source called spirulina, harvested from the lake surface and pressed into cakes that were eaten fresh or dried and crumbled over other dishes. Turkey was kept domestically and eaten on significant occasions. Dogs of a specific hairless breed were raised for consumption. Insects, including grasshoppers and the larvae of various aquatic flies, provided protein and were considered delicacies rather than hardship foods. The homes of ordinary Mexica families were modest by the standards of the elite, but not, by the standards of the ancient world, uncomfortable. Most were single-story structures built around a central courtyard, constructed of adobe brick or stone depending on the resources of the family, with thatched or flat earthen roofs. Each home had a small shrine where the family conducted its own private devotions, maintaining a relationship with the divine that did not depend entirely on the great public ceremonies of the temple. There was a sweat bath, the temazcal, which was standard equipment in most households, used for hygiene, for healing illness, and for ritual purification. Cleanliness was not a luxury in Mexica culture. It was a civic and spiritual expectation. Tenochtitlan had public latrines positioned along its causeways. Human waste was collected by canoe and used as fertilizer on the chinampas. The lake city recycled its own byproducts with a practical ingenuity that kept it remarkably clean by the standards of any contemporary urban center anywhere in the world. Children were, in the Mexica worldview, precious and also somewhat dangerous in the sense that their fate was at least partially determined by the day of their birth and required careful management from the very beginning. A midwife attended every birth and immediately began a stream of formal orations over the newborn, addressing the child, addressing the gods, acknowledging the difficulty and pain of the mother, welcoming the new person into a world that was beautiful and also full of suffering. Within a few days, a priest consulted the tonal pohuali to determine the child's birth sign and its implications, and the naming ceremony that followed was a formal, family-wide event at which the child was introduced to the world with speeches of the Huehuetlatoli tradition. Those layered and beautiful formal addresses that told the child who they were, what was expected of them, and what kind of world they had entered. Girls were told in these speeches that their domain was the home. The imagery was specific and deliberate. Just as a man's heart should be in the battlefield in the marketplace, a woman's heart was told to be in the hearth, in the metate, in the loom. Mexica women wove, and weaving was not a domestic afterthought. Woven cloth was tribute. Woven cloth was currency. Woven cloth was the medium through which a woman's skill and industry made itself legible to the wider economy of the empire. A woman who wove beautifully was contributing to the household's wealth in a form that the empire's entire tribute system recognized and depended upon. The equivalence between female weaving and male warfare as complementary forms of socially necessary labor was made explicit in the formal speeches given at birth, and the midwife buried the umbilical cord of a newborn girl beneath the hearth where the grinding stone stood, just as the cord of a newborn boy was given to warriors to bury on a battlefield. The geography of destiny established from the very beginning, and yet the lives of Mexica women were not as constrained as that imagery might suggest. Women could own property. They could inherit and bequeath it. They could bring legal cases to the courts and testify on their own behalf. Older women, particularly those of the noble class, exercised substantial influence within family and political networks. Women ran the market stalls in Tlatelolco in significant numbers. Female healers and midwives commanded professional respect and specialized knowledge that gave them authority in spaces where the formal hierarchy of priests and warriors did not reach. The picture is one of defined gender roles operating within a social framework that nevertheless recognized women as full legal persons with agency and rights, a picture that is more complex than either simple patriarchy or simple egalitarianism can adequately describe. The market at Tlatelolco was the great equalizer of daily Mexica life. the place where the hierarchies of birth and status were temporarily suspended by the democracy of commerce, where a noble's wife and a farmer's wife might stand at the same stall examining the same cloth and haggling with the same vendor. It operated on a 5-day cycle, with the largest market day drawing tens of thousands of people from across the valley and beyond. The noise and smell and color of it were overwhelming to the Spanish soldiers who walked through it, and their written accounts, whatever their other biases, agree that it was organized with a discipline and efficiency that put the markets of Madrid and Seville to shame. Goods were arranged by category. Prices were, to some extent, regulated. Disputes were resolved by roving judges on the spot. Fraud was taken seriously and punished. The whole apparatus of commercial civilization, the standardization, the regulation, the legal oversight, was present and functioning outside the market and the household. Communal life was organized around the cycle of festivals that the ritual calendar generated throughout the year. There were 18 20-day months in the solar calendar, and each carried its own festival, its own ceremonies, its own particular foods and dances and obligations. Some festivals were solemn and terrifying, marked by major sacrificial ceremonies at the great temples. Others were more festive in character, involving communal feasting, music, dancing, and the kind of collective celebration that temporarily suspended ordinary hierarchies and let people simply be members of the same community together. Music was central to this festive life. The Mexica had an extraordinary range of instruments, drums of various kinds including the great vertical huehuetl and the horizontal teponaztli, both of which produced specific pitch tones and were played with a sophistication that impressed even Spanish observers who had no particular incentive to be impressed. There were flutes, rattles, rasps, and conch-shell trumpets. There was song, extensive and formally composed, with a tradition of poetry and lyric that the Nahuatl language, with its capacity for elaborate metaphor and parallelism, was particularly well suited to sustain. Dancing accompanied nearly all ceremonial music, and it was participatory rather than performed, communities moving together in patterns that had their own cosmological meanings, tracing in collective movement the paths of celestial bodies or the shapes of sacred stories. The ball game, Ulimalistli, occupied a place in Mexico public life that was simultaneously athletic, recreational, and deeply religious. The rubber ball, heavy and solid, could only be struck with the hips, knees, and elbows, never the hands or feet. And the game was played on a long, narrow court with stone rings mounted high on the walls through which the ball might, with extraordinary skill and fortune, be driven. Every major city had a ball court. Tenochtitlan had several. The game had a cosmological dimension connected to the movement of heavenly bodies, and major matches carried religious significance, sometimes associated with divinatory outcomes. Whether regular recreational games carried the same weight of sacrificial consequence that dramatic post-conquest accounts sometimes suggest, is a matter historians continue to debate. What is clear is that the ball game was woven into the fabric of Mexico public life at every level, from the grandest ceremonial occasions to the ordinary afternoons of city living. What emerges from all of this, when you step back and take in the whole picture, is a civilization of remarkable density and texture. Not a simple hierarchy of rulers and subjects, priests and victims, warriors and farmers, but a layered and interconnected world in which every person, from the Tlatoani in his palace to the woman grinding maize before dawn in a one-room adobe house on the edge of a chinampa, occupied a defined place in a system that gave their life meaning, structure, and a relationship to the sacred that was immediate and daily rather than distant and theoretical. It was not a perfect world. No civilization has ever managed that. It was a world organized around beliefs that could produce extraordinary beauty and extraordinary cruelty in the same breath, which is, if we are honest about it, not so different from most of the world's human beings have managed to construct, but it was profoundly, unmistakably alive. And then the ships came. There is a passage in a collection of Nahuatl texts compiled after the conquest, drawn from the testimonies of Mexica survivors, that describes the moment the people of Tenochtitlan first heard about the strangers who had arrived on the eastern coast. It describes the messengers coming before Moctezuma, breathless, carrying painted images of what they had seen. Men who rode on the backs of enormous deer, men with faces half covered in hair, men who carried thunder in their hands and wore mountains of metal on their bodies, men accompanied by great animals with hanging ears and lolling tongues that moved like a river of dogs across the land. Moctezuma listened to all of this, and then, according to the texts, he felt something that the Nahuatl word describes as a kind of swooning dread. His heart, the texts say, was tormented. He would sometimes sit very still and say nothing for a long time. He was not, by any account, a coward. He was a man of deep religious conviction trying to process an event that his entire intellectual and theological framework was straining to accommodate. The omens had been multiplying for years before the Spanish arrived. A comet had appeared in the night sky. The great temple of Huitzilopochtli had caught fire without any visible cause. The lake around Tenochtitlan had boiled up without wind and flooded parts of the city. A woman's voice had been heard weeping in the night streets, calling out that her children were being lost. These omens were recorded, interpreted, and found troubling in the way that only a civilization supremely attentive to signs and portents can find things troubling, which is to say, deeply and without easy resolution. Into this atmosphere of accumulated unease came Hernán Cortés, 34 years old, a minor Spanish nobleman of modest fortune and immodest ambition, who had sailed from Cuba in February of 1519 with 11 ships, roughly 500 soldiers, 16 horses, and a collection of artillery pieces that were about to change the political map of an entire hemisphere. He had sailed, technically, without the full authorization of the Cuban governor Diego Velázquez, a jurisdictional problem he solved with characteristic boldness by burning his ships on the Mexican coast, removing the possibility of retreat and binding his men to the enterprise whether they wished to remain bound or not. The coast he landed on was not ignorant of him for long. Moctezuma's information network, that system of runners and merchant intelligence that knitted the empire together, brought word of the Spanish presence to Tenochtitlan remarkably quickly. Ambassadors were sent. Gifts of extraordinary value were dispatched, gold and featherwork and jade, and the full regalia associated in Mexica theology with the god Quetzalcoatl, the deity who had departed eastward across the sea and promised to return. Whether Moctezuma genuinely believed Cortés might be Quetzalcoatl, or whether he was employing the diplomatic language of that mythology to manage a situation he had not yet fully assessed, is a question the historical record refuses to answer cleanly. What is clear is that the gifts had the opposite of their intended effect. The gold convinced Cortés that there was more where it had come from. It accelerated him rather than satisfying him. As Cortés moved inland from the coast, something happened that Moctezuma's intelligence network had not adequately prepared him for, something that would prove more consequential than the horses or the guns or the steel. The subject and neighboring peoples of the empire began to join the Spanish, not all of them, and not always willingly, but in numbers that fundamentally altered the military equation within weeks of the Spanish arrival. The Totonacs on the coast, long resentful of their tribute obligations to Tenochtitlan, allied with Cortés almost immediately. Then, after a period of fierce fighting followed by careful negotiation that revealed Cortés's considerable political intelligence, the Tlaxcalans joined him. The Tlaxcalans, those unconquered rivals who had fought the Mexica through generations of flower wars, who had accumulated their own deep reserves of grievance and wounded pride, brought with them thousands of warriors who knew Mexica tactics, knew the terrain, and had every personal and political reason to want the Triple Alliance broken. This is the aspect of the conquest that later nationalist historiography, both Spanish and Mexican, has most consistently obscured. The fall of the Aztec Empire was not a story of European technology overwhelming indigenous resistance. It was a story of an indigenous coalition, led and organized by a small group of Europeans, dismantling an unpopular imperial system from within. The Tlaxcalans and the dozens of other peoples who joined or supported the Spanish campaign did so with clear eyes and their own political calculations. They wanted the tribute to stop. They wanted Tenochtitlan humbled. They wanted, in many cases, specific local enemies defeated, that their calculations turned out to be catastrophically wrong, that they had replaced one imperial power with one incomparably more destructive and permanent, is one of the great tragic ironies of the period. But they were not naive. They were making the best political decisions available to them with the information they had, which is what all political actors do, and the Mexica themselves would have recognized the logic entirely. Cortés arrived at the causeway entrance to Tenochtitlan in November of 1519, and Moctezuma came out to meet him. The encounter between these two men, the most consequential meeting between two individuals in the history of the Americas, was mediated by interpreters and surrounded by the elaborate protocol of two very different forms of power acknowledging each other. Moctezuma was carried in a litter. The ground before him was swept. Those who accompanied him kept their eyes lowered. The Spanish watched all of this and noted it. Cortés attempted an embrace. The Mexica lords beside Moctezuma physically prevented it. The protocols of contact and distance were already in that first moment breaking down. Cortés was invited into the city. He accepted. What followed was a period of uneasy cohabitation in which the Spanish were simultaneously guests and prisoners, housed in a great palace, fed and attended, while both sides attempted to understand what the other intended, and neither side fully succeeded. Within weeks, Cortés had made a decision of audacious violence. He seized Moctezuma. He took the Tlatoani, the speaker, the axis of the empire, and placed him under a form of house arrest within his own palace, using him as a hostage to control the city and compel the continued flow of tribute and gold. The Mexican nobility and the military leadership were paralyzed. The protocols around the person of the Tlatoani were so absolute, so deeply embedded in the theological and political structure of the state, that no one had a clear procedure for responding to what had happened. Their ruler was present. He was alive. He was continuing, under obvious duress, to issue instructions and receive officials. The machinery of governance continued to turn, but something fundamental had been broken, and everyone could feel it without being able to name exactly what had changed. What changed it irrevocably was a massacre. In the spring of 1520, while Cortés was absent from Tenochtitlan dealing with a Spanish force sent from Cuba to arrest him, his second-in-command, Pedro de Alvarado, ordered an attack on Mexican nobles and warriors gathered in the courtyard of the great temple for the festival of Toxcatl. The festival involved singing, dancing, the wearing of the image of Huitzilopochtli, and the presence of the finest warriors and most distinguished nobles of the city. Alvarado's reasons for the attack remain historically murky, possibly a preemptive response to a rumored uprising, possibly simple fear translated into violence. Whatever the cause, the Spanish and their allies sealed the courtyard and killed nearly everyone inside. The dead were the flower of Mexican nobility. The act was an atrocity by any measure, and it ended whatever fragile equilibrium had been maintained. Tenochtitlan rose. The Spanish were besieged in their quarters. Moctezuma, brought out onto a roof to attempt to calm his people, was struck by stones and died within days. Whether from his wounds or from something the Spanish did to him afterward is a question the sources argue about without resolution. On the night the Spanish attempted to flee the city, the Noche Triste, the Night of Sorrows, They were caught on the causeways by Mexican warriors in canoes and cut to pieces. More than half the Spanish force died that night, along with uncounted Tlaxcalan allies and an enormous quantity of the gold they had spent months collecting. Cortés, by some accounts, sat under a tree at the edge of the lake and wept, but he did not leave. He regrouped in Tlaxcala, reinforced, rebuilt his alliance, constructed brigantines, small armed sailing vessels that could be carried overland in pieces and reassembled on the lake, and returned. The siege of Tenochtitlan began in the spring of 1521 and lasted 80 days. It was urban warfare of extraordinary ferocity, the Spanish and their indigenous allies advancing block by block through the causeways and streets of the city, while the Mexica, now under the leadership of the young and fierce Cuauhtémoc, fought from rooftops and canals and demolished their own streets to slow the advance. Disease had already done devastating work inside the city. Smallpox, carried by a member of the Narvaez expedition sent from Cuba to arrest Cortés, had arrived in Tenochtitlan before the siege began and killed somewhere between a third and half of the population, including the Tlatoani Cuitlahuac, who had led the uprising that drove the Spanish out. The Mexica who fought through the siege of 1521 were fighting through a city full of their own dead, starving, without fresh water after the aqueducts were cut, without the possibility of reinforcement from a subject empire that had largely already made its own calculations. Cuauhtémoc was captured, attempting to escape by canoe on August 13, 1521. When he was brought before Cortés, he reportedly touched the dagger at the Spaniard's belt and asked to be killed with it. He was not. He was tortured for information about hidden gold, his feet burned, and kept alive as a political instrument before being executed 3 years later on a campaign in Honduras on the accusation, probably fabricated, of plotting rebellion. Tenochtitlan was leveled. The Templo Mayor was demolished stone by stone. Mexico City was built on top of it, the cathedral rising almost directly over the site of the Great Pyramid, a deliberate theological statement written in architecture. For centuries, the Mexica past lay buried under the streets of a Spanish colonial capital, present everywhere beneath the surface and officially acknowledged almost nowhere above it. The broken spears lay in the road. The houses were roofless. The walls were red with blood. The waters had turned crimson. These are not my words. They are from a Nahuatl poem written by a survivor, preserved in the collections that Sahagún compiled, the voice of someone who had stood in the ruins and tried to find language adequate to what had happened. They managed it, just barely, with a grief that has not diminished in 500 years. There is a moment that occurs in every serious encounter with the Aztec world. Whether you are standing in the Anthropology Museum in Mexico City looking at the Great Sunstone, or reading the surviving poetry in Nahuatl, or simply sitting with the weight of what this civilization accomplished and what was done to it, the moment is a kind of double vision. You see simultaneously what was there and what is gone, the presence and the absence occupying the same space at the same time. And the experience is not quite grief and not quite wonder, but something that contains both and exceeds them. 500 years is a long time, and it is also, in the scale of what was lost, almost nothing. The destruction that followed the fall of Tenochtitlan was not accidental, and it was not incidental. It was policy. The Spanish colonial project required, as all colonial projects require, that the civilization being replaced be made to seem as though it had never quite been a civilization at all. Temples were demolished. Painted books, the Amoxtli, those extraordinary repositories of Mexica history, astronomy, theology, and genealogy, were gathered and burned in quantities that represent one of the great intellectual catastrophes in human history. Bishop Juan de Zumarraga, the first bishop of Mexico City, oversaw the burning of an unknown but certainly enormous number of these manuscripts in the years immediately following the conquest. What survived did so almost by accident, hidden away, overlooked, or preserved by the handful of Spanish friars who had enough intellectual curiosity and moral courage to recognize that what they were watching disappear was irreplaceable. Bernardino de Sahagún was the most important of these, a Franciscan friar who arrived in Mexico in 1529, less than a decade after the fall of Tenochtitlan. Sahagún spent the rest of his long life doing something that was, in the context of his time and institution, nearly radical. He learned Nahuatl. He trained indigenous scholars to work alongside him. He went to Mexico survivors, elders, former priests, former warriors, former merchants, and he asked them to tell him everything they could remember about the world before the Spanish came. The result, compiled over decades, was a 12-volume work known as the General History of the Things of New Spain, or the Florentine Codex, named for the Medici Library in Florence where the manuscript eventually came to rest. It is the single most comprehensive account of Mexican civilization that exists. And it exists because one man decided that the truth of what had been there mattered more than the convenience of its erasure. Even Sahagún's work was not safe. The Spanish colonial authorities confiscated his manuscripts multiple times, uneasy with the depth of attention he was paying to a culture they were trying to suppress. He retrieved them, continued, persisted with the stubbornness of a man who understood that he was racing against the forgetting that institutional power was actively trying to produce. What survived the burning and the confiscation and the deliberate suppression is fragmentary but extraordinary. 15 or so pre-conquest pictorial manuscripts remain, each one a window into a world that their creators could not have known was about to end. The Dresden Codex, one of the surviving Maya manuscripts, points toward the kind of astronomical and calendrical sophistication that characterized the broader Mesoamerican intellectual tradition. The Mexican manuscripts that survive, the Codex Borgia, the Tonalamatal Orbin, the Codex Mendoza, commissioned by the Spanish viceroy, but drawn by indigenous artists in indigenous visual conventions, show us the ritual calendar, the tribute system, the life cycle ceremonies, the warfare, the cosmology, in a visual language that modern scholars have spent generations learning to read with increasing confidence and humility. The Nahuatl language itself survived, which is perhaps the most significant preservation of all. Languages are not merely communication systems. They are the architecture of a particular way of being in the world, the accumulated metaphors and structures through which a civilization thinks about time and nature, and the sacred and the self. Nahuatl today is spoken by well over 1 million people in Mexico, making it the most widely spoken indigenous language in the country. It bent under the weight of colonialism, absorbed Spanish loanwords, lost formal registers that had no surviving community of speakers, changed as all living languages change, but it persisted, carried forward by communities in the mountains and valleys of central Mexico, who maintained it as their daily tongue across 5 centuries of pressure to abandon it. The words we use every day in English and Spanish carry more of the Mexico world than most people realize. Chocolate comes from the Nahuatl, Zocolatle. Tomato from Tomatle. Avocado from Aguacatle. Chili from Chile. Coyote from Coyotl. Axolotl. That strange and beautiful salamander endemic to Mexican lakes carries its Nahuatl name intact into every language that has borrowed it. These are not merely etymological curiosities. They are evidence of the degree to which the Mexico world shaped the material culture of the entire planet, because the foods and plants and animals they knew passed through the Columbian exchange into European agriculture, and from there into global cuisine, changing what human beings eat everywhere on Earth so thoroughly that it is now impossible to imagine Italian cooking without the tomato, or South Asian cooking without the chili pepper, both of which arrived in those culinary traditions from the Americas through the disruption that the conquest initiated. The Templo Mayor itself, buried under Mexico City for centuries, was rediscovered in 1978 when electrical workers digging near the cathedral struck a massive carved stone disc. It depicted Coyolxauhqui, the dismembered moon goddess, the same figure whose shattered image had stood at the base of the Great Pyramid for 200 years. The discovery triggered one of the most significant archaeological excavations of the 20th century, conducted in the heart of a living city of 20 million people, requiring the demolition of colonial-era buildings to expose what lay beneath. What emerged from the earth was extraordinary. Thousands of offerings deposited by successive Mexican rulers, objects gathered from across the empire and beyond, coral and shells from the ocean coasts, sculptures of distant deities, the remains of animals including jaguars and eagles and wolves, greenstone masks of immense beauty and age, objects that had been old when the Mexica deposited them, deliberately collected from even earlier civilizations as a way of concentrating antiquity and power in the sacred center of their world. The Templo Mayor Museum stands beside the excavation site today, and it is one of the great museums in the Americas, a place where the sheer density and quality of what was recovered communicates something that no written account fully manages: the sense of a civilization operating at the absolute height of its creative and institutional powers, right up until the moment everything stopped. In Mexico, the relationship with the Aztec past is complex in ways that defy simple summary. The Mexica are simultaneously national symbols and historical subjects of critique. The eagle on the Mexican flag, perched on a cactus with a serpent in its beak, is drawn directly from the founding myth of Tenochtitlan, the sign that Huitzilopochtli had promised would mark the place where his people should build their city. Mexica imagery is woven into Mexican national identity at a depth that Spanish colonial architecture and Catholic iconography sit beside rather than replace. And yet the living descendants of the peoples the Mexica conquered and taxed and sacrificed also constitute the present population of Mexico, and their relationship to the Aztec past is not uncomplicated pride. It is something more layered, an inheritance that contains both the magnificence of what was built and the weight of what that building cost the people who lived under it. This tension is honest and necessary. The Mexica Empire was not a golden age of universal harmony. It was an imperial system that extracted tribute through the credible threat of military violence, that practiced human sacrifice on a scale that inflicted real suffering on real people, that maintained rigid hierarchies of class and gender, that constrained the lives of the majority of its population. These things are true. They do not cancel the achievement of Tenochtitlan, or the brilliance of the calendar, or the beauty of the poetry, or the sophistication of the market at Tlatelolco. They exist alongside those things, as the shadow exists alongside the light, and a complete reckoning with the civilization requires holding both. What the Aztec world ultimately offers us, at this distance of 5 centuries, is something rarer than a simple lesson. It offers a genuine encounter with a radical human difference, a civilization that organized its entire existence around a cosmological premise, that the universe was sustained by sacrifice, that time was a living structure with texture and quality, that the proper response to mortality was not denial, but a fierce and ceremonially elaborate embrace of the transience of all beautiful things. This is not our premise. It is not the premise of any contemporary civilization, and precisely because it is so different, so genuinely foreign to the assumptions we carry without noticing we carry them, it has the power to illuminate those assumptions by contrast, to make visible the choices baked into our own worldview, by showing us a world that chose differently. The Nahuatl poets understood impermanence in a way that their flower imagery makes permanent. One of the most repeated images across surviving Mexica poetry is the flower that blooms and then is gone, the jade that shatters, the Quetzal feather that loses its color. Nothing lasts. The poem itself is an act of defiance against that fact, an attempt to fix in language something that the physical world will not hold. In one of the most celebrated poems attributed to the Texcocan ruler and philosopher Nezahualcóyotl, the question is asked directly: is it true that one lives on earth? The answer given is not consoling. It acknowledges that even the most beautiful things, jade, gold, quetzal plumes, are not forever. That even the earth itself is not forever. But the asking of the question, the making of the poem, the act of language reaching toward permanence while acknowledging impermanence, is offered as its own kind of answer. The Mexica built for eternity and were gone in 2 years. What they left behind, in the earth and in the language and in the food and in the blood of millions of living descendants and in the fragments of their manuscripts and in the carved stones that keep emerging from the ground beneath Mexico City, is not eternity. But it is not nothing either. It is the flower still blooming. It is the sun still rising. It is a civilization that burns so brightly and was extinguished so violently, and that speaks across 5 centuries of silence and suppression and rediscovery, with a voice that has not yet finished what it has to say.